All right, 10th grade honors students. This is Mr. Ermer here. I'm going to be reading three articles, short articles, that will be giving us some background information about Fahrenheit 451 and the author Ray Bradbury. Gives us a little information about the events going on during his life, what influenced his identity, and the topics he chose to write about. This is also going to serve as a bit of an exemplar of how to mark up your text a little bit. I'm new at using Notability, so bear with me. All right, Ray Bradbury, books, short stories, and quotes. Author Ray Douglas Bradbury was born on August 22, 1920 in Waukegan, Illinois, to Leonard Spalding Bradbury, a lineman for power and telephone utilities, and Esther Moberg Bradbury, a Swedish immigrant. Bradbury enjoyed a relatively idyllic childhood in Waukegan, which he later incorporated into several semi-autobiographical novels and short stories. As a child, he was a huge fan of magicians and a voracious reader of adventure and fantasy fiction. Quite an active imagination, especially L. Frank Baum, Jules Verne, and Edgar Rice Burroughs. Bradbury decided to become a writer at about age 12 or 13. He later said that he made the decision in hopes of emulating his heroes and to live forever through his fiction. Ambitious. Ray Bradbury's family moved to Los Angeles, California in 1934. As a teenager, he participated in his school's drama club and occasionally befriended Hollywood celebrities. His first official pay as a writer came for contributing a joke to George Burns' Burns and Allen show. After graduation from high school in 1938, Bradbury couldn't afford to go to college, so he went to the local library instead. "Libraries raised me," he later said. "I believe in libraries because most students don't have any money. When I graduated from high school, it was during the Depression, and we had no money. I couldn't go to college, so I went to the library 3 days a week for 10 years. So we could see this bit about libraries. We'll hear more about that later and how he has this affinity or such attraction for libraries and books. Books and short stories. To support himself while he wrote, Bradbury sold newspapers. He published his first short story in a fan magazine in 1938, the same year he graduated from high school. The next year, he published 4 issues of his own fan magazine, Futuria Fantasia. Nearly every piece in the magazine was written by Bradbury himself, so he used a variety of pseudonyms or made-up names, pen names, to try to hide the fact that the magazine was a virtual one-man show. "I was still years away from writing my first good short story," he later said, "but I could see my future. I knew where I wanted to go." And you can hear this ambition in his voice. Bradbury sold his first professional piece of the story Pendulum in November 1941, just a month before the United States entered World War II following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Ruled ineligible for military service by his local draft board because of his vision problems, Bradbury became a full-time writer by early 1943. His first collection of short stories, Dark Carnival, was published in 1947. That same year, he married Marguerite Maggie McClure, whom he met while she was working as a clerk at a bookstore. McClure was the breadwinner in the early days of marriage, supporting Bradbury as he worked on his writing for little to no pay. The couple had 4 daughters, Susan, Ramona, Bettina, and Alexandra. In 1950, Bradbury published his first major work, The Martian Chronicles, which detailed the conflict between humans colonizing the Red Planet and the native Martians they encountered there. While taken by many to be a work of science fiction, Bradbury himself considered it to be fantasy. "I don't write science fiction," he said. "Science fiction is a depiction of the real. Fantasy is a depiction of the unreal. So Martian Chronicles is not science fiction, it's fantasy. It couldn't happen, you see." Television and comic book adaptations of Bradbury's short stories began to appear in 1951, introducing him to a wider audience. Bradbury's best-known work, Fahrenheit 451, published in 1953, became an instant classic in the era of McCarthyism for its exploration of themes of censorship and conformity. So we're looking at kind of silencing talks of communism in the United States, McCarthyism, this idea of censorship or ideas not being welcome. The United States, it's very commonly known, has had a long history of not liking communism. In 2007, Bradbury himself disputed that censorship was the main theme of Fahrenheit 451, instead explaining the book as a story about how television drives away interest in reading. Television gives you the dates of Napoleon, but not who he was. Despite his apparent distaste for television, Bradbury advocated for film adaptations of his work. A little bit of a contradiction there. He wrote numerous screenplays and treatments, including a 1956 take on Moby Dick. In 1986, Bradbury developed his own HBO television series, allowing him to produce adaptations of his short stories. The series ran until 1992. Famously prolific, Bradbury wrote for several hours every day throughout his entire life, allowing him to publish more than 30 books, close to 600 short stories, and numerous poems, essays, screenplays, and plays. Though Bradbury won many honors and awards throughout his life, his favorite was perhaps being named Ideas Consultant for the United States Pavilion at the 1964 World's Fair. Can you imagine how excited I was? He later said about the honor. Because I'm changing lives, and that's the thing. If you could build a good museum, if you could make a good film, if you could build a good World's Fair, if you could build a good mall, you're changing the future. You're influencing people so that they'll get up in the morning and say, hey, it's worthwhile going to work. That's my function, and it should be the function of every science fiction writer around. To offer hope, to name the problem, and then to offer the solution. To name the problem. So, he's ambitious. He has an affinity for libraries. He has a special connection to books. Let's read more about that. All right, this next bit of background information is going to give us some idea of what ideas were driving Ray Bradbury to create the story Fahrenheit 451. This is the next article in our What Was the Author Thinking series, and specifically the story behind Ray Bradbury's 451. Fahrenheit 451. As with the other authors covered in this series, Stephen King and Philip K. Dick, Ray Bradbury also had a unique link to L. Ron Hubbard and Ron's psychological thriller Fear, but more about that later. Just as the events in World War II inspired Philip K. Dick to write Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, that grim event in history also had an impact on Ray Bradbury and his novel. The backstory. Fahrenheit 451 presents a future dystopian American society where books are outlawed, and firemen are charged with burning any that are found. It is named for the fact that at 451 degrees, paper catches fire and burns. Bradbury grew up in Waukegan, Illinois, and hung around the fire station as a kid along with his dad. Later, he heard about book burnings occurring in Germany, Russia, and China, and the story of the great libraries of Alexandria being destroyed by flames some 2,000 years ago. Bradbury frequented libraries starting at the age of 8. As he never attended college, he considered libraries to be his university, in his own words. When I heard about Hitler burning the books in the streets of Berlin, it bothered me terribly. I was 15 when that happened. I was thoroughly in love with libraries, and he, Hitler, was burning me when he did that. The reason why I wrote Fahrenheit is that I am a library person. I am in danger of someday writing something that people might not like, and they might burn. So it was only natural that I sat down and wrote Fahrenheit 451. He's a library person. When Bradbury was 30, he was walking down the street with a friend when a police car pulled up. The policeman got out of the car and one of them asked, "What are you doing?" To which Bradbury replied, "Putting one foot in front of the other." That turned out to be the wrong thing to say, as the policeman didn't appreciate the joke. As it were, that experience resulted in the story The Pedestrian. We're going to read that one later. Bradbury, who would later turn the main character of The Pedestrian into Guy Montag, the protagonist in Fahrenheit. The original title for the novel wasn't Fahrenheit 451, but rather The Fireman, and it was only fitting that Bradbury wrote it in a library. the basement of UCLA's Powell Library on a typewriter that he rented for 10 cents per half hour. He completed the story in 9 days. In a 1956 interview, Bradbury reminisced about the writing of the novel. I wrote this book at a time when I was worried about the way things were going in this country 4 years ago. 1952, we had talked about McCarthyism. So we have this idea that Americans were not welcome to even consider ideas of communism. Communist sympathizers were losing their jobs, were getting threatened by the government. Too many people were afraid of their shadows. There was a threat of book burning. Many of the books were being taken off the shelves at that time. And of course, things have changed a lot in 4 years. Things are going back in a very healthy direction. But at the time, I wanted to do some sort of story where I could comment on what would happen to a country if we let ourselves go too far in this direction, where all thinking stops and the dragon swallows his tail. And we sort of vanish into a limbo. And we destroy ourselves by this sort of action. And in a 2007 interview at the San Diego Comic-Con, he talks about where he was and the special significance it held for him when he wrote Fahrenheit 451. If anybody wants to see that interview, I can get you in touch with that. All right, let's look a little bit about American consumerism. So we have this idea. When we read Fahrenheit 451, you're going to see this idea of idea suppression that we are hearing about from Ray Bradbury, why he was writing the book. But you're also going to see elements of the late 40s and 50s consumerism as part of the culture of Fahrenheit 451. So let's take a little look at that and see if we can notice it when we're reading. The end of World War II, American soldiers returned home to a country quite different from the one they had left 4 years earlier. Wartime production had helped pull America's economy out of the Depression. And from the late 40s on, young adults saw a remarkable rise in their spending power. Jobs were plentiful, wages were higher, people had money, and because of the lack of consumer goods during the war, Americans were eager to spend. During the same years, young couples were marrying and having children at unprecedented rates. This is where the baby boomers come from. News and expanded federal programs, including the GI Bill of Rights, allowed many young families to purchase their own homes, often located in rapidly expanding suburbs. More, newer, better. After World War II, consumer spending no longer meant just satisfying indulgent material desire. In fact, the American consumer was praised as a patriotic citizen in the 50s, contributing to the ultimate success of the American way of life. The good purchaser devoted to more, newer, and better was the good citizen, historian Elizabeth Cohen explained, since economic recovery after a decade and a half of depression and war depended on a dynamic mass consumption economy. Pragmatic spending. Americans invested in items based around home and family life. We're going to see this in Fahrenheit 451. You'll see it. At war's end, the items people most desired included televisions, cars, washing machines, refrigerators, toasters, and vacuum cleaners, the machines that would help to modernize their life. Between 45 and 49, Americans purchased 20 million refrigerators, 21.4 million cars, and 5.5 million stoves, a trend that continued well into the 50s. Historian Elaine Tyler May noted, the values associated with domestic spending upheld traditional American concerns with pragmatism and morality. Rather than opulence and luxury, purchasing for the home helped alleviate traditional American uneasiness with consumption, the fear that spending would lead to decadence. Cars and television and automobile sales skyrocketed in the 50s. With the massive growth in suburban populations, automobiles were needed more than ever and were within reach for many first-time buyers. Families of all income brackets were buying televisions at a rate of $5 million a year. Some TV shows like Goldbergs and The Honeymooners catered to working and middle-class viewers with storylines about ethnic families. In addition, television provided a potent medium for advertisers to reach inside the American homes, creating desires for other products. The Good Life. Historian Elaine Tyler May believes that the federal government and the American people saw the new consumerism as a way to de-emphasize class differences while stressing traditional gender roles. With the things that define the good life within economic reach, working class people could achieve the upward mobility they craved. Selling in order to buy. I'm going to stop there, but you can start to see where this idea of purchasing, purchasing an idea. You have the good life. You have this good life that the American people are trying to achieve. And you could do that through purchasing these household conveniences. That was a big part of what lower and middle class families in America in the late 40s and 50s were doing as they were coming out of this war. Hey, we finally have this money. Let's spend it. Let's achieve this image of the American dream. And you're going to see some of this in the consumerism of Fahrenheit 451. So thanks again, and I hope you've enjoyed the tutorial on how to do some annotations, ideating, or thinking about your reading as I started to do towards the end here. Again, this is my first go at Notability, and I'm navigating new tools myself. So be well, 10th grade honors.